This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this episode 976 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Before I get into today's episode, I have a few things that I want to share. First, last week, this podcast was named Football Podcast of the Year by the Fantasy Sports Writers Association, and that was for a second straight year. I just want to say thank you, and I'm so grateful for your support. Without that support, there would be no Late Round Podcast. And thank you to the FSWA for the recognition. It really means a lot. Now, second, we're now less than a week away from the Late Round Prospect Guide launch. I'm in editing mode right now, so it's not totally done yet, but this thing is a beast this year. I've got profiles for every running back and wide receiver who are at the combine. I've got almost 40 year two profiles. I have information in there on what goes into the ZAP model and that year two model. It's 160 pages long of some super nerdy fantasy football information. And of course, I've got rankings in there too. You can pre-order it right now at $14.99. That's going to change next week though when it launches. That price is going to rise by $5. Then when the draft is over, if you ordered the guide, you'll get a post-draft version sent directly to your inbox on the final day of the draft. That's going to have updated blurbs, prospect scores, and rankings. Learn more about it over on lateround.com. And while you're on lateround.com, do me a favor, sign up for the newsletter. It's absolutely free. As a lot of you know, I hired David Kitchen at the start of January to be Late Round Fantasy Football's COO. And with that, we've been beefing up the newsletter game. You get content from both of us in that newsletter. I'll be sending one out this week about some ZAP model scores. Kitchen, he does a fun recap each week. And again, it's absolutely free. Just head to lateround.com to learn more. Okay, let's get to today's topic, which is the NFL Combine. We just watched this year's prospects run around in shorts, and we did learn a little bit. Now, I think most people who are new to what I do probably assume that my models and the numbers that I work with are hyper-focused on the combine. That's really not the case at all. The only information from the combine that actually goes into my prospect models, the ZAP models, are height and weight measurements, and then I look at speed score at running back and tight end. Speed score being weight-adjusted 40-yard dash times. Now, that doesn't mean that the other events of the combine aren't impacting a player's prospect score, because the biggest input in each model is draft capital, and a team may be influenced by the combine. They likely are influenced by the combine, which then can impact a player's draft capital. So I try to keep that in mind as I think about which players were winners and which players were losers at the NFL Combine. But that's what I'm going to talk through today. Winners and losers from the Combine. Obviously, with a focus on the three positions that I have a prospect model for, which is running back, wide receiver, and tight end. It's a pretty straightforward episode that I do each year, so let's do it. Now, I'm not going to lie. Today's episode is far more good than bad. There were way more winners this year in my eyes than losers. Let's start with the most obvious winner, and that's Matthew Golden. He ran a 4.29 40. People knew that he was fast. I'm not sure that anyone was prepared for that kind of speed. Now, I talked about Golden a little bit on the episode that I did a couple of weeks ago on wide receivers who produce like studs in college. And I gotta be honest, his production profile, it's not very strong for a first-round wide receiver. And I think with that 40 time, he's probably now a first-round wide receiver. Before it was kind of up in the air. Now, Golden's breakout score is 51.4. For those who don't know, breakout score is my metric that looks at age-adjusted receiving yards per team pass attempt numbers. Obviously, there's more about that in the prospect guide, but that's the gist. Golden's 51.4 breakout score, it's fine, but it's far from great. It's barely above average. We've had 22 first and second round wide receivers drafted between 2011 and 2022 with breakout scores below 60. Only 4 of those 22 wideouts scored 14 or more PPR points per game in either year 1, year 2, or year 3. Now, I don't think Golden has the worst production profile that we've seen from a potential first round pick, but is definitely well below average. And it puts him in a group of undesirable players, generally speaking. Clearly, he can still hit, but I always get nervous when a dude without a crazy good production profile gets elevated in the draft after what he did at the combine. And there's no doubt that that's probably going to happen. I do think at the end of the day, though, without Travis Hunter being involved, he'll probably end up being the model's wide receiver 4. Now, on the flip side is Isaiah Bond. During the interview portion of the combine, some of you probably saw this, Bond confidently said that he was going to break the 40-yard dash record. And when you watch him play, you can see that speed on display. Like, it seemed like a ridiculous thing to say, but he also is pretty fast. And he did run a fast 40, but to be overshadowed by his Texas teammate wasn't a good thing for him. He didn't run as fast as Matthew Golden. The ZAP model likes Bond's breakout score more, but given draft capital, Golden's almost definitely going to rank ahead of Bond in ZAP score pre and post draft. So I'm going to say that Matthew Golden was a winner, and kind of as a result, Isaiah Bond, given his confidence in how he was talking about the 40, kind of a loser. I think Amarian Hampton solidified himself as the RB2 in this class at the combine. He weighed in at 221 pounds, which is an ideal weight for a bell cow back in the NFL. He then went out and he ran a 4.46 40 at that weight. He had a speed score of almost 112. For context, anything over 100 in speed score is typically fine. Anything over 105, that's great. Anything over 110, that's very great. Now, if I'm being honest, if you're looking for a running back in this class who's going to produce the best comps, it's Hampton. It's not Ashton Genty. In the ZAP model, he gets comped to Ezekiel Elliott and Todd Gurley. Ashton Genty is the better prospect according to the model, but Genty's size profile is just a little bit different. Genty's a more unique prospect. Now, I wrote this in Hampton's profile write-up that I did find interesting. It's sort of a fun with numbers thing. I said, quote, in the ZAP model database, there have only been 2 running backs that hit a 105 speed score at 215 plus pounds while posting a best season reception share of 15% and a top season yards per team play of 2.25. So these backs are big, they're fast, and they had great college production. Those 2 running backs were Todd Gurley and David Johnson. I think Hampton is very legit, to the point where today, right now, I sort of got him in his own tier behind Ashton Genty. We've mostly talked about winners so far, so let's talk about a loser. That's Harold Fannin. There's no doubt about Fannin's production profile. It's awesome. In the tight end ZAP model, which includes all drafted tight ends since 2015, only 1 tight end has a higher career yards per route run rate than Fannin. Now, obviously, Fannin played at Bowling Green. He's awesome in college football 25, by the way. I made the college football playoff with that Bowling Green team. He dominated. But numbers are going to be easier to compile at that kind of program. The tight end model uses speed score as an input, and Fannin ran a 4.72 40. At his 241-pound weight, that gave him a speed score below 100, which is not what you want from a fantasy tight end, generally speaking. And tight ends, their speed scores are generally a little bit better because they're bigger players, better than running backs. The vast majority of high-end talent at tight end in fantasy football had speed scores over 105. Now, some have said that this all shows up on tape, so it's not that surprising. I don't care about the surprise factor. I'm just saying that the fantasy community thought that Fannin was close to the tight end 1 group in this class. It's looking clearer to me that he's in the next tier down. Now, he still looks pretty good in the ZAP model because of his production and because he's still not going to be 21 years old by the time the draft rolls around. So he still looks good, but the combine was not a good result for him. Now, a tight end winner, and the last tight end that I'm going to talk about today, was Terrence Ferguson. Now, I admittedly haven't done as much work on tight ends compared to running backs and wide receivers thus far in the process, because I'm trying to get this prospect guide done. The guide only includes tight ends once the draft is over. But Ferguson ran the fastest 40 among tight ends of the combine at 4.63. He's now looking like the tight end 5 in the model, but that's with projected draft capital before the combine. His athleticism showing off, he had a 107 speed score, that could easily increase that mark, increase that draft capital. His production metrics were pretty average, but sometimes athleticism is all we need at tight end, as long as there's some production backbone. And with him, there is. So he's someone to watch. Analysts seem to like Travion Henderson, or I guess he's going by Trey now, but analysts seem to like him more than Ohio State teammate Quinshon Judkins. I know the ZAP model does because Henderson has the type of receiving profile that typically does well at the next level. Now, Judkins has always been more of the bruiser to Henderson being more of the agile pass catcher. But Judkins had an impressive combine specifically with his 40. And yes, I keep bringing up 40s because that's the thing that matters most here for fantasy purposes. Judkins had a 109.7 speed score after weighing in at 221 pounds and running a 4.48 40. He wasn't that much slower than Henderson, and we consider Henderson the big play threat. Now, the production profiles for these running backs, they're going to be more important than their weight-adjusted 40 times. And where Judkins lacks within the ZAP model is with receiving metrics. His breakout score, which is driven by receiving yards per team pass attempt at running back, just like wide receiver, it's 46.5. The class average this year is 59.4. Now, I don't think that he's incapable as a pass catcher, but consider this. The ZAP model has seen 22 running backs get drafted in the top 100 with breakout scores below 60 and top season reception shares under 10%. Judkins is likely going to join this group post-draft. Of those 22, only 2 of them ended up seeing a target share per game rate in one of their first 3 seasons in the NFL above 9%. And one of those 2 was Jerick McKinnon, who didn't play a traditional running back role in college. The other one was Doug Martin. To put that all another way, when running backs have the receiving profiles that Judkins has, they usually aren't used as big pass catchers at the next level. I think we're likely looking at a running back in Judkins who's more of like a 7-8% target share player at the next level. And that does matter for fantasy purposes. Now, fortunately, he's got the size-speed combination to potentially make a serious impact in fantasy still. It's not like he absolutely needs that 15-16% target share. But I do think his ceiling is a little bit capped. Jalen Knoll, which he tweeted over the weekend, is pronounced Knoll and not Noel. But Jalen Knoll had a legit combine. And I'm excited about it because he looks pretty good in the ZAP model. He was one of my favorite lower key players in the wide receiver class entering the combine. I actually like both of the Iowa State guys. But let's talk Knoll. He was a freak testing-wise at the combine. And while none of the metrics directly connect to the ZAP model, I do think he improved on his draft stock quite a bit. He ran a sub 4.4 40. He was at the top of the leaderboard with his vertical and broad jumps. His 3-cone time was also excellent. I mean, at the end of the day, he tested as arguably the most athletic wide receiver at the combine. The problem is that he's a little bit smaller at 5'10", 194. But I don't actually consider that a problem at all. More on wide receiver size later. The thing that I like about Knoll analytically is that all of his numbers are basically above average. He's got a 76th percentile breakout score compared to the rest of the draft class. He has a career yards per route run rate in the 58th percentile. And he ran a variety of routes in college. He had some seasons where his average at the target was really low out of the slot, but then other seasons where he was getting down the field more. And he did it all at Iowa State. Receiving work, ground game work, special teams work. Knoll's comps could have been better in the ZAP model, and you'll see that in the prospect guide. But I think he's pretty underrated at the moment, though the combine might change that. One of the lower key winners at the combine, in my opinion, was Dante Thornton. Thornton's from Tennessee. He played at Oregon as well. He also didn't get a ton of playing time in college. He only ran 509 routes across his 4 seasons. And he was 4th in wide receiver routes last year, his final season. That's why he doesn't have a breakout score, because breakout score is driven by receiving yards per team pass attempt, and receiving yards is a volume-driven statistic. But when counting all wide receivers in the ZAP model database since 2020, Thornton's career yards per route run, this is courtesy of PFF, it ranks in about the 90th percentile. He can get deep. Last year at Tennessee, his ADOT was 16.5. And then at the combine, only Matthew Golden ran a faster 40. But here's the thing. Dante Thornton is 6'5", 205 pounds. It's always good when the measurables match what the production generally says. He's a deep ball guy who may be able to find the field because of that speed. And for an afterthought right now, that's kind of interesting. It's not like he looks amazing in the ZAP model. He doesn't even have a breakout score. But when you're throwing darts late in your draft, that's the kind of guy that you want to throw a dart at. Someone who has some trait that you can really latch onto. So I thought that I would give him a shout today too. There were 2 bigger bodied backs who had slower 40 times at the combine. But did it actually matter? I've seen a lot about Caleb Johnson and Ollie Gordon having bad combines because Johnson ran a 4.57 40, Gordon ran a 4.61. But this is why speed score matters. Speed score doesn't tell you who's going to be the fastest in the NFL or who the fastest is, period. Like, Xavier Worthy had the fastest 40 time in history last year. He's clearly one of the fastest players in the league. But his speed score, it's not that high because he's lighter. He doesn't weigh that much. It's showing you how a player is moving at a certain weight. It gives you an idea of overall athleticism. Caleb Johnson's speed score was still almost 103. Ollie Gordon was at 100 because they're both big backs. Yeah, they ran a little bit slow, but they both weigh a lot. Their speed scores weren't elite, but they also weren't some death sentence. But I am bringing them both up today as losers, only because this class is filled with so many good running backs. And there are a lot of running backs sort of in that weight range, maybe a little bit smaller, who did come through with elite speed scores. DJ Giddens, Rocket Sanders, RJ Harvey, Montrell Johnson. All of those guys really improved their draft stock and became more intriguing options. Johnson and Gordon didn't. Therefore, Gordon and Johnson ended up losing a little bit of ground. Basically, with Gordon and Johnson's 40 times, there was a chance that either one of them could have moved into better analytical groupings if they had a good 40. I don't think the world was expecting like elite 40 times or anything. But if they were sub 4.5 or even lower 4.5s, it would have made a little bit of a difference. That's why they're being tagged as losers. Probably the biggest running back winner at the Combine was a player that I had talked about on last week's episode, and that's Bashal Tutin. Tutin was already a Zap model favorite because his production profile was pretty strong. He has good receiving numbers. He got it done at an early age, albeit against weaker competition at the start of his collegiate career, but overall, good production profile. And then he went out, he had the fastest 40 time of any running back at the Combine. He ran a 4.32 40 at 206 pounds. He had a 118 speed score, which is pretty ridiculous. Now, Tutin's comps right now in the Zap model are kind of all over the place, but I think it's because his outlook has a pretty wide range of outcomes. On one end, Tutin profiles like a Darrington Evans type. Tutin's a little bit bigger, he's a little bit faster, but it is a decent enough comp. Evans got top 100 draft capital. Don't forget about that. He just hasn't worked out in the NFL. But hold on to your butts when I say this. Tutin's top comp in the model right now is Kenneth Walker. Now, obviously, that comp isn't as valid if Tutin's draft capital doesn't rise from the Combine. But analytically, there are a lot of connections. Otherwise, the Zap model wouldn't have shown Walker as a decent match. Their size profiles are similar. They both ran fast 40s. They had elite speed scores. They both have strong breakout scores. Now, I know that Walker had some receiving concerns entering the NFL. His reception share is low, but his breakout score was really good because he saw a decent baseline of receiving work at a young age. I think that's the high-end outcome here, of course. And with Walker, we at least felt good about his floor. I don't think we have that same safety net with Bashal Tutin, but he definitely helped his cause at the Combine. Now, the final player I want to get to today is Tez Johnson. Wide receiver size, wide receiver weight, it doesn't matter nearly as much as it does at running back in the Zap model. But it does matter for ceiling purposes. We don't get a ton of lighter wide receivers in fantasy football who are consistently giving us wide receiver 1 seasons. In the Zap model, we have 14 wide receivers who weighed under 170 pounds at the Combine. Tez Johnson, for the record, 154 pounds. He's the second lightest wideout in the database, only ahead of Tutu Atwell. Now, of those 14 wide receivers who are south of 170 pounds, only Hollywood Brown, Tank Dell, Devontae Smith, and Xavier Worthy have been able to score 10 or more PPR points per game in one of their first 3 years in the league. The problem is that it's very easy to argue that all of those 4 wide receiver profiles are better than Tez Johnson's. 3 of those 4 had breakout scores above 92, which is borderline elite. Not only that, but those players showed us that they could play both inside and outside in college. Their career slot rates were all under 50%. 2 of them were under 20%. Johnson's career slot rate, according to PFF data, almost 90%. So ask yourself, how is a 154-pound wide receiver going to win on the perimeter at the next level? Well, probably with speed. And Johnson, he went out, he couldn't break a 4.5 40, which is pretty rough for a dude as small as he is. Now, he did well in the agility drills, and he had a good explosion score too. That's staring at us and telling us that he's probably just going to be a slot player. This is not a scenario like we've seen in the past where a lighter wide receiver is going to play all over the formation. It looks very, very likely that Johnson's a slot guy. But that's not going to give us the fantasy upside that we want. I don't know if a 154-pound wide receiver can see a lot of volume in the NFL. I think that's a reasonable thing to question. And him being a really good slot guy is not really differentiating him as a player. Had he run faster, we can at least make some case that a team could get more creative with his skill set. But now, there are more questions than answers. Johnson had good per route run numbers at times at school. And I do think he's a capable slot player. But he may end up just being a better real football player than fantasy football player. For him to really hit, he's going to have to be unlike any other wide receiver prospect that we've seen over the last 15 or so years. That's really something that's tough to bank on. Now, clearly with so many players participating at the combine, I could go on and on about winners and losers. I just wanted to call out the guys who I found the most interesting, the players who will probably shift the most in the ZAP model. If you're interested in some more analysis, of course, go check out the prospect guide. I don't think you're going to regret it. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. I've got a Late Round Perspectives episode coming to you later in the week. I'm super excited about that. I'll talk to you then.